Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is an update from Washington, D.C. on public policy and COVID developments. This webinar is brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and Precision Metal Forming Association. I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. My colleague Paul Nathanson and I do public relations for NTMA and PMA. So we do strategic communications planning and outreach to media, as well as digital communication for both associations and through One Voice. Joining me on the webinar today is Omar Nashashibi from the Franklin Partnership. Omar and John are the on-the-ground lobbyists for NTMA and PMA here in Washington, D.C. And our two firms work together, as we'll describe in a couple of examples today, amplifying the voices of small and medium-sized manufacturers from throughout the country here in Washington, D.C. to make sure your voices are heard on policy issues that matter most to you. We have a little bit of a leaner presentation team today, just Omar and me, and Paul and John will be back next time. But you can also catch all four of us on our Talking with One Voice podcast. You can get that wherever you get your podcast. We'll have a slide about that at the end of the presentation, but I did want to flag it at the beginning as well. We have still a packed agenda, though a leaner presentation team. We'll be talking about federal agency activities as well as regulatory updates. We'll talk a little bit about supply chains and workforce, and particularly how those two factors are represented in ongoing legislation up on Capitol Hill. So with that, I will turn it over to Omar. Omar, take it away.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. We'll jump into it here. We're going to be a little heavy on regulations in the HR side. OSHA is really ramping up quite a bit, so please make sure that you pass this along, and recording will be made available in about a couple of hours afterwards and sent out to all registered attendees along with a copy of the presentation, since there's a few links to be aware of as we go through here. Only two quick slides on COVID. Just obviously the update with regards to legal challenges underway for masks on transportation. The CDC has a couple of updates that they've put out. Obviously, there's been a lawsuit that has gone through down in Florida that has put the mask mandates on public transportation, including on federal airplanes and airspace. That now is still down with the courts and injunctions being held. Our understanding there is the next step is likely that the administration is challenging the authority to block it, not necessarily because they want to reimpose a mask mandate, just because they don't want CDC's hands to be tied in such a manner by a single court down the line. That's the latest on where it stands as of there. There are no further updates from the CDC with regards to compliance, other than they continue to encourage people to wear masks on planes. The CDC community levels. This one is a little bit newer, came out just after we put together our last presentation last month, so we wanted to make people aware of this. Down at the local level with regards to decision making, and that's where CDC is again trying to drive most of this out of Washington and down to local communities where you have certain flare-ups and spreads. And these are the new community level indicators that are going to be used locally when you take a look at the new of cases and admissions and hospitalizations and the levels that they're using. But they also take a look at on the left side, it's fewer than 200, more than 200, and then they do the overall ranking based on a percentage, and it's determined on the higher of the new admissions and inpatient beds metrics rather than new cases that are also there. They do a combination and looking at the new hospitalizations as the new metrics that are out there. So those are just the two ones that we have on COVID we wanted to throw out there and make you aware, and we did just double check again this morning from CDC, and there's nothing further in those two spaces beyond those two documents. Jumping back to general regulatory compliance and what we are seeing coming out of the federal government that we want you to be aware of for the next 30 days. Here, the EEOC report, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I think most of you know that your EEO1 component 1 data collection period is now currently open. For those that are private sector employers with 100 or more employees are required to file this. It is going to be due on May 17th. What this does, this goes back to the Obama era. Maybe 2015 or so, we were working on this, where it requires more information to be submitted than was previously indicated on the forms that will include demographics such as data by race, ethnicity, sex, and job categories. What the Obama administration especially was doing towards the end is they would then be able to take this data and they would be able to sort it and look at different companies to go and initiate cases after. So the collection of that information, and that's how that is used Please be aware if you are a government contractor, the threshold is 50 or more employees. You need to file your EEO-1 coming up by May 17th. So please make sure that you have that compliance ready to go. Another one that we wanted to bring back, also reminiscent from the Obama administration, deals with your forms 300 and your 301s, and also under OSHA here. You all should have just had, or probably just taken down recently, your 300A forms. This is in addition to that. The Obama people try to do a couple of things by, they wanted you to file your 300 logs and your 301 forms and put those on electronically and disseminate some of that information for a threshold of 200 or 50 employees or more. This new Biden rule is different. It changes the threshold and says establishments with 100 or more employees, because manufacturing fits into the 31 through 33 NAICS codes. So any establishment in manufacturing with 100 or more employees has to submit their Form 300 log and your 301 incident report electronically. Again, that's similar to what you've been doing already on your 300As that have been filed on usually around March 2nd every year, but this is again more expensive information. Our concern here comes from a workforce standpoint. We argued back in 2014 and 15 when this was first brought up, is that we're simply just going to take data and put it out in the public without explanation. That could create a misperception of manufacturing as dark, dirty, dangerous. And that's going to be problematic for us when we try to recruit employees and workers. And we've seen that. We've seen the information be distorted. An employee could be trained properly, just twist their back incorrectly, and now is scheduled or prescribed ibuprofen, and that's now a recordable incident. And those, again, are challenges out there. There are public comment period that is now open. Again, this is a proposed rule. It is not one that is in place yet, but they are accepting public comments. We will be filing that as well. Please, if you'd like more information on this record-keeping proposal, click on that link at the bottom of the screen there. Another area that we wanted also flagged for you for a couple of our friends over in Arizona, and we'll make sure our chapter and our district over there have this information as well. And not just for you that are in Arizona, but in other states. As many of you know, OSHA has a two-part compliance structure. They have a number of states, I think 34 or 35 of them, have state plans that have been approved by OSHA, whereby the state can on its own set standards that are at least as strong as those of the federal OSHA guidelines, and then the state can pretty much regulate itself. Well, now they're reconsidering what's being permitted for the state of Arizona. And as you can see by this notice that they put out just recently, a couple of weeks ago, that they believe that the state is not complying with the number of the patterns of failures that they've got there, not complying with the standards and not doing enough enforcement. And so this is a warning letter that the federal government rather may go in and take over and withdraw the state's ability to regulate itself. Keep this in mind. If this is, we've got a few more years at least left in the Biden administration. If this is a trend that might continue with some red states in particular, that's something to watch, which could mean a somewhat change in regulatory structure and regime and compliance for some of you all as well. We were going to spend the next 3 slides quickly on the heat index as we're approaching summer months. Many of you have heard us speak before about the new 80-degree heat index rule that OSHA is proposing. What the federal government wants to do is put out a regulation for both indoor and outdoor spaces. When the heat index, not temperature, but when the heat index exceeds 80 degrees in any part of the workplace, then certain requirements would be put in effect. For example, they have already prescribed how much water or hydration an individual would need over certain hours, depending on the temperature in that workspace. They also will potentially prescribe, if this rule would go through, how many hours, how much rest they need every so often. So 15-minute breaks every 2 hours is an example that's put out, and also PPE and engineering controls and fans, obviously. That is if they move forward and when they do with the broader rule on heat index. What you're seeing on this slide is called a National Emphasis Program. There are currently 11 National Emphasis Programs in effect under federal OSHA. What it is exactly as it sounds like. It is an emphasis program for OSHA inspectors. When they go into a shop for this issue or an unrelated one, they are being instructed by the federal office to also place an additional emphasis on a number of areas. And now heat is one of those spaces. Again, as you can see, they say 80 degrees or higher. This is directly from the NEP that was issued a few weeks ago that directs the OSHA area offices to assess for potential heat-related illnesses, injuries, and heat-related hazards that may exist in indoor work areas, which is what affects our members. Especially going into the summer months, with a lot of our members, this could potentially be a significant issue. Again, this is not the full rule that we have been talking about. It's something that OSHA can do on its own without moving forward through the rulemaking process. And you'll see where they're looking at additional emphasis on heat wave announced by the NWS, looking at working indoors near radiant heat sources, which does affect a number of our manufacturers. Please keep this in mind, especially if you have an OSHA visit scheduled coming up here over the next 3 to 4 months, that know that the inspectors have been told to watch out for this issue and to make it part of their routine inspections as you move forward. A couple of things, you can take a look at this link above, the second down below. The link of the NEPs are there. You can take a look since some of them are already in effect. And then also the full PDF of the actual document. We selected portions of it for your review here. That document, that PDF, does include a sample list of NAICS codes. NAICS are the replacement for the SIC codes. The replacement happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. So NAICS are the North American Industrial Classification System codes. Every single one of you is classified under at least one of these. Most of our members will fall under either 332 or 333. And so there's a couple of areas in here that are going to be under the emphasis program, but note that even beyond these targeted NAICS, our understanding is OSHA is going to be looking at general all manufacturing under 31 through 33 as part of this national emphasis program. We did want to give you an example of where potentially they might be going with regards to the rule when they finally do come forward with it. And they are looking at using an app. They already have an app that is in effect for outdoor workplaces, and that's what we're showing you here. Note this is not the indoor, this is only the outdoor one. But those of you that might have an outdoor loading dock or an area like that where you might want to test this out over the summer to see what might be potentially coming towards you, you can do this. This is exactly what they will be using over the Department of Labor. It was developed by NIOSH. NIOSH is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Basically, think of it as NIH combined with OSHA, and they do research when it comes to workplace safety and PPE. They approve all the masks that you all have been wore previously. So now what the NIOSH is looking at is developing the app for indoor. Our understanding as of March, they were not complete, but they have started to test it. They have not finished it successfully. So that's what you can see here as a sample. And then lastly, on heat index, before we move on to other regulations, this is the actual rule going back. Again, just to keep clear, the previous slides I mentioned were the National Emphasis Program. The NEP is currently in effect now. This potential rule is a proposal that they were going to go even broader. That's what's happening. There's a meeting scheduled for Monday. They added another hour. It's supposed to only go from noon to 5. They now made it noon to 6. I'm scheduled to speak as well on our concerns with regards to the heat rule and public stakeholder meeting at some point during that process. So know that anyone that wants to listen in or participate and understand a little bit more, that meeting is coming up here on Monday, I believe it is. So keep that in mind. And you can feel free to register at that link below. It's open to the public. Department of Labor, also sticking with them, the last one over on workplace related on the HR side of things. The Department of Labor is moving forward with their overtime rule. We've talked about this in the past. I think John brought this up back in March, and again, in March. What is happening is the nominee for Labor Department's Wage and Hour Division was rejected by the U.S. Senate. I think he lost like 2 or 3 Senate Democrats. So that person is not there, which has led to the delay over a WHD of the overtime increase. Right now, your overtime threshold, I believe, is 35,568, meaning anybody that is a salaried employee that's an EAP, that's an executive, administrative, professional, or clerical classification, earning under that 35,568 is subject to overtime, time and a half. So our members do double pay on Sundays, for example. Those would be subject to that currently. The proposal, as we understand it, would take the threshold from that 35,000 to at least 53. We're hearing 53, 55, maybe as high as $58,000 annually for salaried employees, with many on the outside groups calling for 83,000 is the number that they want to do. Keep in mind, this also impacts highly compensated employees, HCEs, which I believe are currently at 107,000 annually, I believe that is. And they were going to try to take that up higher to 130,000. So people under that are subject to it. As of now, they're not changing the duty clause, the duties test rather, but that is something that they've asked about in some of their comments. We've been on at least 2 or 3 of these so far. with the Department of Labor, SBA, and Advocacy Office. So we encourage folks that if you are available and are impacted by this overtime threshold increase, please feel free to listen in. The registration is down below for some of the upcoming regional webinars and listening sessions the Department of Labor is hosting with regards to overtime. We're hearing, based on this schedule, as you can see, they're not going to issue this rule anymore. This month obviously is over, which was the plan. We're probably slipping now into the summer, depending on what happens with their next nominee. Quickly here on the IRS side, employee retention tax credit. I know there's been some confusion with regards to what's happening there. What the IRS just put out a notice a couple of weeks ago saying that if you are looking at a retroactive claim, so if you dust off your cobwebs, you were allowed to do retroactive claims. You were also allowed to fill out a form saying these are what my expected claims will be, and then you do an adjustment later. What the IRS is basically saying here, that if there are issues with regards to penalties and some of the unable to pay because of the refund payment has not been received under the ERTC when you made your adjustments and assessments, then you're just going to have to go through the process of the first-time penalty abatement program, which you do not want to go through, assuming that what describes here is you're going to have to go through that normal process, and then you go through it. But at least they're telling you that there is a hold harmless provision here. If you do move forward with that and have the challenge on the payment, then they're going to give you an out as long as you go through that process that's there. That's the only thing we saw from the IRS with regards to ERTC updates and other major tax credits. The only other one on regulatory before we jump over to tariffs, trade, and supply chains, we wanted to make you aware of a few government contractors out there, especially some of our mid-sized members. There are some changes that the Small Business Administration is doing as part of its 5-year review. They have not changed business size standards in some time. So what they're looking at, not all NAICS codes, most of ours actually weren't really affected. These are just some of them that were there. Like didn't really see any on the 333s or the machine shops get their size adjusted. But as you can tell right here, they're just making the size standards bigger, which what that means is now companies under 700 that are in die casting foundries, for example, would be considered small businesses eligible for contracts. And they're just trying to adjust for some growth there, which is regular. They just haven't done it in a while. FYI for you government contractors. Jumping over to tariffs, trade, and supply chains and where things might stand there. Just a heads up, I know there's a lot of discussion lately on with regards to where the energy and prices are and what the administration is doing. This one is not related to the administration. This is just private sector. But just to give you an idea of what's happening in the last week, for those of you that aren't aware of what Baker Hughes does, they've been putting out this for 80 some odd years now, 70 some odd years. They've been collecting data on the number of oil rigs that are coming online, new ones, and the changes here. And you can see that in the last year, we've added 257 new oil rigs just in the United States. And when you take the North America, we're getting past the 300 range. So that's not, it's progress. That obviously takes some time, but just a heads up as some of you are trying to think through the summer months and some of your winter month, in fact, energy costs and where that might stand. This is just an indicator that we use for some other clients that are really focused on the oil and gas industry and some of our members that supply those folks as well. We thought this might be helpful to give you a quick snapshot. And as below, you can see how that chart has that increased over time to match up with the top one for Baker Hughes. We do, if you are in that industry, we definitely encourage you. They put that out, I think it's it's Houston. So they do it mid-afternoon every Friday afternoon, I believe it is. Export-Import Bank, this is something we talked about in our February, or it might have been our March presentation. We were giving you a heads up on the Biden administration put out as part of their manufacturing initiative a call on the Export-Import Bank to change its charter to allow to provide domestic financing for manufacturing facilities and infrastructure projects that ultimately could lead or would directly lead to export. So what they normally do over at Export-Import Bank is they will help you with financing. They'll look at a country if you're going and have some risk. They'll help with accounts receivable insurance. They do government-backed loans where a traditional lender may feel that it's too risky for you to go into that area or to purchase from there. The XM now officially, they haven't put out the full paperwork, which is why I have to email. But if you go to that link, it'll give you a little bit more information. The Export-Import Bank of the United States will provide financing to support establishment or expansion of U.S. manufacturing facilities and infrastructure projects to facilitate U.S. exports, especially in sectors that are critical to national security. XM is actually, it's lean. They're pretty easy to work with. In our experience, we did some work with them. We had a number of, especially aerospace and other suppliers, about 5-6 years ago, really show how much of that had helped. in some of those spaces. So we do encourage you to take a look at there. And sorry, some of the lines got shifted around here, but essentially here on the export, there's going to be two criterias that you take a look at. The transaction eligibilities are going to be focused on your exports for small businesses, at where you want to see that climate, where the Nexus is going to be at 15%. So the percentage of your production or shipments that are going to be tied to exports, if you want to be eligible for this, is really only at 15%. And when we look at the number of our members that export, it's actually over 50% in our combined annual survey. Usually around 55% of our members are direct exporters, and it's pretty sizable. Indirect exporters, it's well above that. It's in the 80s, 70s, and 80s because of your customers doing that. So for projects in other sectors outside of those small business areas, it'll be a 25% related to that export to be required. And then also you've got a jobs quotient down below, and you can take a look at what they look at a job year and how much financing. So it'll give you kind of the formula is already prescribed out there. So for those that are interested, we definitely suggest that you take a look and take advantage of this, where traditional lending either is not an option or this might be a better source to supplement some of what you are already doing. A couple of things here, and I want to bring in Caitlin in just a slide or so, just to kind of show what we've been able to do together and the importance of us working both on the PR and the strategic side and on the lobbying with regards to the progress we've made on what we call the China competition bill. Many of you recall, as we've reported, the House has passed the America Competes Act that tries to beef up U.S. innovation and competition, especially in the semiconductor range, and they passed that with 1 Republican vote and 1 Democrat against. The Senate last summer passed by a bipartisan 68-32 vote their USICA bill, which is the precursor to what the House did. Both bills have $52.7 billion for semiconductor manufacturing and incentives here in the United States, and also to their supply community. So that part we believe will remain in there. There are a number of other provisions that I'll get into, but here's where we are. The Senate officially moved this week to appoint conferees. What a conferee is they're negotiators. Now the House has passed their version, the Senate has theirs. The two chambers have to, quote, reconcile. It means they have to work out their differences. There's 107 total conferees between the House and the Senate. The House has 80 some odd, the Senate has 26. And that's where we end up. The Senate is equally divided, 13 and 13, Republican, Democrat, and most of them are committee chairs or rankings with some other leaders. We're close to a few of them that have been really strong on this issue, such as Senator Todd Young, a Republican of Indiana, who's written a large part of the domestic supply chain part of it. So they're going to start working through their motion to instruct conferees. There's 28 of those votes even happening today. And once we get to there, negotiations start hopefully next week. Our sense, though, is now we're going to slip past July 4th and probably closer to the end of July, early August, before we get this thing done. Again, there's 107 negotiators in the House and Senate. Most of you that have been around me and us kind of know that Congress doesn't work that efficiently, and the more you add is not necessarily a good thing. In the end, this thing's going to be written by a handful of leadership people and a few others that we've been working with for some time. Question is, what's in it? We know the semiconductor language will be in there. Trade adjustment assistance for firms is something that we've been lobbying on. That does have Republican opposition. They'd rather save that when they are in control next year, can use that as a bargaining chip with the Biden White House on trade promotion authority. The China tariff language, what we're hearing on that right now is there's a very strong effort that could potentially succeed to restart the exclusion process. Some of you may recall the Section 301 tariffs that the former President Trump put in place. He also allowed companies to petition USTR to not have to pay the 25 or 7.5% tariffs through an exclusion process. That process is now closed. The lobbying community for the importers is pushing hard, and we think they are going to likely succeed in reopening it. The question is, what does that look like? And there's some groups that are pushing back on that as well. The big part that we're also working on is the mapping of supply chains and the providing and support in creating an Office of Supply Chain Resiliency at the Department of Commerce to make sure that the government knows what we have capable here domestically and can purchase more, or have the private sector purchase more domestically by understanding what we all make as supply chains. This isn't looking at PPE and finished goods. It's more focused on the downstreams, the tier 2s, the tier 3s, the machine tooling and those kinds of things is what they're really getting into the weeds on, trying to figure those out. So those are some of the things they're still going to be negotiating. I think next month we'll have a better sense. Over the next 3 weeks, the official negotiations will begin. We've been lobbying those folks since last summer on it, so we're in a good place. But Caitlin, I think increasingly we're starting to see a lot about this bill in the media because everybody wants a piece of it.
Yep, and I wanted to show this in today's webinar. This is a press release from Senator Susan Collins' office talking about the introduction of this bill. And what I think is interesting about this press release for this group is down at the bottom, you can see the bill is endorsed by, and both of our association names are listed there. I think this matters because it shows how our government relations and strategic communications sections work together, and the role that NTMA and PMA plays in politics and in the issues that matter most to manufacturers. As Omar said, there's a lot of attention about this legislation, both on the Hill and in the media. Everybody wants to know what manufacturers think about it. They want your endorsement of the legislation and support for it, both on the Hill and also in media. Thank you to those folks who volunteer to speak with media. And if there are other people on the call who would like to talk about this legislation or other issues, we do always welcome that. And you can feel free to reach out to me directly or to your association and let them know that you're available for that. But the takeaway here is that your StratCom and government relations sections are working really closely together to make sure that when we're pushing for policy positions like this, we're making that voice public and being a part of that discussion on the Hill.
Yeah, because they also, the folks on the Hill, they need this and they want it. I mean, it makes their boss look good, it makes them look good, and it gives us points when we're going back to them and saying, okay, now here's what we really need in this bill. And over the last month especially, there's been a lot on the Republican and Democrat side emphasis on the media outreach with regards to this bill that moving forward is going to be called the Bipartisan Innovation Act. And we do think it's going to be very significant. And we do, Caitlin's point, appreciate everyone jumping in on this one. It's going to be probably the more important, hopefully, manufacturing bill that we've done in some time. Quickly, as we get ready to wrap up here in the next 3-4 minutes, just wanted to give you the latest with regards to the customs and tariff rate quotas on steel and aluminum. Since what we've got is the most recent information, we now have almost a full month under our belt with the Japan TRQ in place. Just a reminder, you've all seen this before. If you've heard us speak, this is where you go to find out how much is left in the quota with regards to steel and aluminum coming in. Every Monday afternoon around 2 or 3 Eastern, Customs will post this. Click on the link below, it'll drop up. They keep usually the last 4 or 5 or 6 rather quota bulletin periods there. What you'll see is similar, as again, we've shown you in the past, just the latest update. We do want you to know, just take a look at the top, just in the first 4 days and then 11 days of that quarterly quota period that began on April the 1st, you had a hot roll plate already from Sweden get full. You know, it's not a significant amount on Belgium, but again, that was full 4 days in at 8:01 p.m. Eastern time. So that gives you an idea if you are starting to look at the rest of the quarter, what might be out there, and you're already at 97 for a hot rolled sheet. In some places, plate cut in length from Sweden also is probably at this point, since that was a week old, you're probably past the 70, maybe even 75% full. So understand, even if you're not importing, your service center might be, this is just overall the new pricing reality. Also want to flag for you, we are now 4 weeks into Japan. That began on April 1st, and you can take a look at cold rolled sheet stainless coming from Japan is at 48%, which means it's probably halfway through full, and we're only 4 weeks into the quarter. Reminder down at the bottom, aluminum, EUAL, that means aluminum. That is on a semi-annual basis, and you can see how the Hungarian sheet was already full at about 5 weeks or 6 weeks rather into the year. Lastly, as you all know, aluminum prices still continue to go up. As you can see here from the different numbers, the US price is the one in gray that still is hovering well above some of the others out there, and the LME contract price that's out there, and what the Europeans are paying. So our inputs are still above what our counterparts in Europe and our competitors in China are facing right now. Same on steel. A couple things on steel. You all are more the experts than us, but just want to flag out there, and this is just the combination where you look at hot rolled and scrap. I got plate on the next slide, but just keep in mind that some of this, the down is because of the lack of demand coming from China due to zero COVID in some of their major industrial areas, and some of their coke and coal demand is down since they're just not using as much. And that is probably what we're hearing is part of the reason for the latest dip in some of the prices that you see on here, but that's just in those areas. And then you go back to our plate, which a lot of our tool and die members are using, and you can still see as of a couple of weeks ago, it's still way up there in terms of what we're paying. And again, we're seeing this everything from wood pallets all across the board. But Caitlin, I think that a lot of our manufacturers are still seeing that economic conditions are working pretty well.
That's right. And these are just a couple of examples of places where One Voice has been in the media. We always like to show this to you just as a reminder that the outreach that you do or that we assist you in doing to media really does matter. PMA, as almost everybody on this webinar knows, puts out a monthly business conditions report. That report is a benchmark for the industry, no doubt. It gets picked up in the media, gets run in local and national trade press. People look to it for insight on what to expect. So here's just an example of the latest, and it's there in Crain's Cleveland Business. Also, NTMA had a couple of good hits over the last month, particularly on programs designed around workforce. This is an article about the Pennsylvania chapter and some of the efforts that they are making. Those are great stories. They're particularly important from a government relations perspective because one of our key messages, of course, is that as manufacturers, we're not sitting around waiting for the government to solve the problem. We are out making efforts on our own to recruit another generation of skilled workers. And these stories really drive that home and emphasize the importance of the groundswell efforts, which then, of course, can be aided and amplified by government. So these are great stories. And please do reach out to us if you have stories you want us to share or have ideas for stories where we could be helpful to you. Speaking of stories and things, information to listen to, you can listen to the podcast. This is what I mentioned at the top of the webinar. This is the Talking with One Voice podcast. It's a bi-weekly podcast. Paul and I, as well as Omar and John, are regular hosts of the show. We talk about a lot of what we talk about on this webinar and a little bit more politics too. So you can tune into that wherever you get your podcasts. If you are already a listener of the show, and many of you are, please remember to rate or review the show because that helps other folks in the industry find it.
Absolutely. And thanks everybody for your support. Appreciate it. We're trying to know we're kind of dense and heavy. Please feel free to type in any questions over there. And as always, your support is always much appreciated. As you can see, we've got our hands full on regulations. We believe pending the election outcomes, we're going to have even more of a regulatory challenge coming in the next 2 years. Of course, as you just saw from the preview of some of the issues that we've got going on here just in the next month or so. Again, feel free to type in any questions. Please feel free to follow up with us or Christy or Bill at PMA and NTMA at any time. Again, we know this was a little bit more heavy on the regulatory side, so please make sure you forward this on to your HR folks if you found this useful at all. Seeing no questions coming in as of now, again, feel free to reach out at any time. We will have this webinar again next month. It will be a week earlier than normal due to the Memorial Day holiday weekend, so look out for that registration coming out as well. Again, this will be sent out here in the next couple of hours. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you all and have a good weekend.